youth. One would expect that with such a large youth population, Africa's leadership would be constituted by a majority or notable youth count. However, the opposite is true. The Parliamentary Monitoring Group released figures in 2021 that depicted that the average age of a member of parliament in South Africa is 59 years old, notably older than the age range that constitutes youth. The effects of climate change have seen the documented physical effects on young children and adults in the form of parasitic diseases, gastrointestinal issues, malnutrition due to exposure to toxins, floods, fires, droughts, and rising sea levels. Psychological and mental effects are also prevalent, with an increase in the reported cases of depression, anxiety, sleep and cognitive deficits, and PTSD. A study on the effects of climate change on the youth that was conducted in Ghana revealed that on-the-ground impacts of the climate crisis included an increase in early childhood marriage, increased school dropouts due to low returns on agricultural production that resulted in the inability to pay school fees, droughts and floods, which inevitably lead to increased levels of migration and displacement. One would expect that in the light of the aforementioned, governments would, within their context, increase efforts to protect the youth population from the adverse effects of climate change in order to preserve its culture and cultivate it. However, once again, the opposite rings true. A recent study indicated that across the countries of Nigeria, Brazil, France, Portugal, India, the US, and the UK, an estimated 65% of young people felt their government was failing them when it came to effectively addressing climate change, with 60% feeling that governments were dismissing legitimate concerns surrounding the crisis. Africa is not only a mineral-rich continent, but one that by its natural constitution of the youth demographic has a rich future. If Africa's youth are not protected, its future cannot be guaranteed. And as such, it's important for African leaders to not only act in mitigating the impacts of climate change on the region, but further include youth in policy-making spaces so that the majority's voices are heard, but most importantly, that the decisions that are made that will impact our future are determined by our future. Thank you so much for listening to that. And just to really emphasize that today's panel discussion, I'm really joined with some amazing, amazing people who are going to be joining us in our panel discussion. So let me just introduce them briefly. First joining me will be Mr. Mishe Gondo. Mishe Gondo is an author, the regional coordinator for the Southern Africa Youth Forum, and sits in the Dengue Advisory Board to fight neglected tropical diseases. He sits in the Global Coalition for Youth, Peace and Security, which is an AU CSO initiative to advance youth and peace. We then have Mr. Lieben Bebe, who is the youth coordinator at SAYA. He is an accomplished project manager with over 16 years of professional experience in organizational development, project management, integrated program development, youth development, gender analysis, and business incubation. We are then also joined by Mukasiri Sibanda. Mukasiri is the Stop the Bleeding Consortium coordinator that steers a Pan-African campaign that seeks to curb IFFs from tax, debt, trade, and investment injustices. He is a chartered governance and accounting finalist. Then we have Ms. Bupe Banda Mango, who is currently the project manager at Resource Africa. Bupe studied environmental education at the University of Zambia, and followed this with an internship at Zambia's Department of National Parks. She has over 6 years experience in the CBNRM sector, which has given her the knowledge and understanding of communities and their role in conservation, both from the government and community perspectives. Then we are joined by Ms. Yvonne Taguire, who is a public policy specialist and a gender and child rights expert with 15 years experience in the human rights sector. Yvonne has an LLB from the Nelson Mandela University and is currently the executive director of the Article 21 Consulting, a consulting firm offering consulting services on human rights in Africa, and is also an external expert for the African Union Working Group on Child Rights and Business. Before I open up to my panel, I would just like to once again remind my panelists and just to also let the audience know of the questions that my panelists will be answering to. And then after they've provided their answers, which will be 5 minutes each, we'll then open up for a Q&A session where they can further elaborate on their points of expertise. So my first question would be for Mr. Mishe Gondo. SIOC and Southern Africa Trust recently hosted what I would argue is the greatest youth-led youth forum leading up to COP27. The fourth SIOC Youth Forum, where we discuss the priorities of the youth across the spectrum, but a special focus on the climate crisis. Out of this, an official declaration that outlined the need for a common youth position towards COP to be hosted in Nigeria was formally launched and submitted and tabled to and by the SADC Secretariat. In light of this, could you speak on the impact of climate change and what it truly has been on the youth population of Africa, and what youth coalitions we have been seeing emerging at a national, regional, and international level? Ms. Yvonne Tagwire. Yvonne, as a public policy expert and child rights expert and a member of the AU Working Group on the Children's Rights and Business, are there policies in place that protect young children and the youth from the devastating impacts of the climate crisis, as will be mentioned by our previous honorable speaker? If they are, can we arguably say that there's a lack of political will on the part of the leaders of Africa to effectively implement same and protect what is not only Africa, but the world's largest youth population and the globe's future? Would an inability to adequately implement regional protective policies hamper their credibility? Mr. Mukasiri Sibanda, we as the youth and citizens of Africa could come up with the best strategies to combat the climate crisis, but without the adequate financial resources and backing essentially from the global north, who are the greatest emitters of the current pandemic, we essentially cannot act. For the benefit of those on the call who may not necessarily understand the concept of climate financing, briefly explain same to us and expand on how we as Africans can demand for the adequate financing to not only reach us at a regional level, but ensure we have the securities to ensure it reaches the most vulnerable populations at a grassroots level. Ms. Banda Mango, CBNRM, which for the benefit of the listeners is community-based natural resource management, at its very essence sees the communities at which natural resources, minerals, and wildlife are present benefiting from the extraction or use of same, and not the standard practice of all profits only benefiting big corporates or wildlife or gaming power players. In your experience, what impacts have you seen the climate crisis having on rural and natural resource-rich communities? And what role has the youth taken to advocate or combat against the illicit expropriation and deprivation of these communities? Lastly, Mr. Lieberman Bebe, colleagues will speak to what needs to be done to avoid irreversibly hindering Africa's future, in particular its youth demographic. However, I think it's important to respond to the youth despondency that I have been many a witness to. Every African revolution that drastically changed the lives of Africans for the better has been led by the youth. However, in the face of gruesome human rights violations, extreme levels of corruption, and blatant abuse of power, the youth are tired and have lost complete faith in the government's ability to lead its people and fulfill their promises. If the adequate political will is not exercised by the leaders of the continent of Africa, what future do you foresee for the youth, and how would you advocate for youth advocacy, even in the instances where they have limited access to resources? So I think I will now open up the floor to my panelists, and we'll start with Mr. Mishe Gondo.
Thank you, Shuni. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yes, you're very audible.
Thank you very much. It's such an honor and a great privilege to present on such a regional platform. And indeed, I acknowledge the video that you have played in terms of the young people describing and also explaining the issues that we are facing currently and homogeneously in terms of the climate crisis, not only in our region, SADC, but also in Africa and the world at large. And within the 5 minutes that you have gave me, I'll indeed respond to some of the issues that have been highlighted. And I want to acknowledge what you mentioned at the previous SADC Youth Forum that was hosted in South Africa, and it was officially opened by the government of South Africa through Dr. Zuma and officially closed by the government of Madagascar, and attended by several young people online and offline. And quite key discussions emerged ahead of COP27 and some of the issues that have been highlighted, and focusing firstly on the issues that we are facing in the region. We are facing a crisis. The region, if you look at SADC, we've been faced with cyclones, we've been faced with floods, we've been faced with droughts, and that is a courtesy call to us all to make sure that, and if you look at that, Shuni, you'll find out that the young people, the women, the people with disability are the most affected, as you have highlighted that. What are the challenges that the young people are facing? I agree with what Dr. Zuma mentioned during the SADC Youth Forum when she was representing the government of South Africa during the official opening, to say, young people, we have a role to make sure that we don't just come and discuss, but also provide adequate solutions to these challenges that we are facing. And what are these challenges that we are facing and in common? I have mentioned previously what the young people during the video that you played during the beginning, what they've said, and some of them. But I want to go to other critical challenges. If you look at the young people living with disabilities, I'm being guided by more than 2,500 young people that have joined online and those who attended physically during the SADC Youth Forum. During the discussion on the disability, we have heard that young people, especially those with albinism, they are being affected with regard to their health. The issue of climate change and change of temperatures. We are also witnessing the increase of rare diseases and neglected tropical diseases. And this is aiding to the costs of young people. And if you look at the healthcare in Southern Africa, young people, even before climate change, they've been not having access to health. So I've decided to start with those common issues, like uncommon issues, because someone will quickly say climate change will result to general poverty, which is true. But what are the tiny issues that are affecting young people? If you also look at the issue of climate crisis, look at the issues of rising conflict. We need also to measure, I think with SciOf we did a paper around that, how the nexus between climate change, development, and conflict. And you realize that because a lot of people are being displaced, a lot of crops are being destroyed, you are finding that this is increasing poverty. And what is happening is that whenever there is poverty, conflict tend to rise. Even political violence itself, because people, they will be waiting for the government to provide food. So we have also a number of issues that are affecting young people currently. And my presentation is quite easy, Shume, because I'm just taking from what young people said in the forum and in the previous forums. Apart from the loss of jobs that are common, that are being created by climate change, the issue of not having access to jobs, because if you look at Africa, we are based on natural resources, we are based on agriculture. So the advent of climate change is affecting our factors of production. And what are the factors of production? We are talking of land, labor, and capital. Two of them, land and capital, they are coming from the effects that are being destroyed by climate change. So that's why we are at a result of climate crisis. If you are not going to respond to this, then this is going to be a challenge. Climate change is also affecting the issue of social life. Imagine the displacements that have been done in Mozambique, in Malawi, in Zimbabwe during Cyclone Idai. And there's been cohesion, there have been cultural integration that has been there previously. And young people are being displaced. 3 weeks ago, I heard of a media update that there were some people that were taken out from Zimbabwe through Cyclone Idai, and their bones were discovered. You know, that's traumatizing to hear. And this is the crisis that we are facing ahead of COP27. And indeed, as I move to conclusion, you realize that as we go to COP27, there were some issues that were being raised in terms of what can we do as young people. We need to be stakeholders, stockholders, and leaders for transformation. And the SADC Youth Forum, they made a call. One of the calls is we need a common position as young people. So what we are going to do, we realize that as Southern Africa Youth Forum or working with SADC, we can't do it alone. There's SAYE, there's ZELA, there's among other organizations. We need to set a platform whereby we integrate what are the concerns, what are the issues that we are advocating for as young people, and what are the issues that we can also work with our governments at local level. Last week, we launched, after the post-SADC Youth Forum, we launched the initiative, SADC Youth Core for climate action that we are working with SAT. And one of the initiative is going also to capacitate young people as negotiators, is going to train general young people to be able to intervene with regard to environmental management. But also what is quite critical is we have also adopted, we are going to release a call next week, whereby we are going to establish at the office of SADC Youth Climate Youth Envoy, a young person that will be also harmonize our voice as in the SADC region, and to make sure that even our voice we consolidate as an advocacy strategy, but also as an exit. We have an environmental protection dialogue that we are going to host in Zambia. Those in Zambia, please get in touch with us. We are working with Center for Environmental Justice. And in Zimbabwe, 20 to 21, we have got Climate Change Environmental Conference, which is also a regional conference under that. So we are moving to different countries. But the aspect is to make sure that we harmonize the youth voice towards the COP27 and beyond. We engage our governments. We have got a climate cluster, which is called Environment Climate Change Cluster. They are also going to meet with ministers of environment to discuss the outcomes of the SADC Youth Forum. The first meeting is in the few weeks with the government of Madagascar, and we invite the partners to be with us so that we incorporate youth concerns within at national level. Then we move at regional level, then working with youth organizations, but also at international level. So for now, let me end there, and I'll be waiting also to further discuss how best can we soldier on with regard to this crisis that is before us. Back to you, Shumira.
Thank you so much, Mishek. You know, you highlighted some very critical points, and I would encourage everyone who's on the call to please follow SIOP on their social media platforms. They really are carrying the SADC youth voice and taking it quite far. And I like what you mentioned, Mishek, about Cyclone Idai and the devastation and the displacement that it left. But I kind of think that, you know, people went in, they provided relief and they left. There was really no action afterwards. And I think maybe that's what the youth can do. That should be our role, that these issues don't die. I didn't even see that issue about finding bones in the news at all. But when Cyclone Idai hit, everyone was there. All the big players, we won't name names, were there. And then after a month or 2 or 3, everyone goes back to their lives. And then people are left with the detrimental impacts of that. So thank you so much for that, Mishek. And, you know, with no further ado, I'll move to Ms. Yvonne Tagwire. Yvonne, you can take the floor.
Thank you so much, Shumirai. I hope I'm audible.
Very audible, yes.
All right, thanks. So thanks, Shumi, for the very pertinent question that you've posed to me. And after an analysis of your question, it really covers 3 aspects, which I'll aim to address in the 5 minutes that I have. So from the outset, I think it is important for us to note that indeed the adverse impacts of climate change, and these are mostly affected, affect children and young people, as really rightfully mentioned by the previous speaker, Mishek. And this really affects young people's access to the highest standards of attainable health, quality and accessible education, and more importantly as well, the protection from violence, abuse, and neglect. So we already know the impacts of climate change currently. And when we look into the normative frameworks or the legal and policy frameworks that exist, we actually can say that globally, there is a plethora of laws and policies that are well established and which our own African governments have committed to domesticating at national level. So the principal legal policy framework at global level is the UN Paris Agreement on Climate Change, which is a commitment by states globally to respect and promote, as well as to consider their respective obligations on human rights, including the rights to access environment and to take action to address climate change. And out of the UN Paris Agreement on Climate Change also is the Kyoto Protocol, which really extended the 1992 United Nations framework on climate change, which also equally commits for state parties within the UN to reduce greenhouse and gas emissions. From the United Nations level, we also have the Declaration on Children and Youth and Climate Action, as well as something that I'm closely advocating within the region to also have a similar framework at regional level, which is the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, as well as the Child Rights and Business Principles that really speaks into the importance of our governments putting in place the necessary systems and structures to hold businesses accountable for the effect that they have on the environment, and particularly for children and young people, as well as women and the most vulnerable. And of significance of importance is also the SDG target, SDG 13, looking into target 13.3, which really focuses on priorities to improve education, awareness raising, human rights and institutional capacity to really address climate change and put in place adaptation as well as early warning systems. The United Nations Human Rights Council resolutions 37.8, 35.20, 40.11 are also very instrumental when we talk about the policies that are put in place for the rights of children and young people with respect to the environment and to the protection of children from environmental harm and climate change. And they really zero in on the importance of putting in place safe cities, as well as ensuring that there are adaptation strategies to ensure that there's safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, which is essential to human life, human development, and also to transition from a safe adulthood. So at global level, we are finding that there are policy instruments that guide our African member states. And at continental level, however, a lot still needs to be done to put in place instructive instruments which would create a binding obligation regionally to address the issue of climate change. So we really need to put to task the African Union, our member states, and also our regional economic communities such as SADC, the East African Community, ECOWAS, and COMESA, to really look into the impact of climate change within our respective sub-regions. However, there are some pre-existing normative frameworks that, if interpreted closely, could really create a protective environment for children and youth from the impacts of climate change. And this is the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, in particular Article 21, which gives effect to the right to free disposal of wealth and access to a healthy environment and natural resources. And as we know, we are really talking about reaping the demographic dividend as espoused by the AU Agenda 2063, and in particular, the aspirations 3, 4, and 6, but as well as the AU Agenda 2040 for children, which really speaks about the Africa we want for our children. And we cannot talk about an Africa we want if we are not looking into the priorities that our AU member states need to put to address climate action. Quite recently, the African Union also promulgated the African Continental Trade Agreement, and we are seeing a lot of our African governments putting in place a lot of political muscle to ensure that as we are putting in place a common African trade market, it's important that we also inculcate the issues of protection of children and young people from the impacts of our business agreements as a region when we are conducting trade. SADC, however, is to be commended for going way ahead of the African Union in terms of developing some frameworks. And this includes the SADC policy paper on climate change, which assesses some of the domesticated ways in which SADC member states can put policy options for addressing climate change. And then we also have the SADC RED strategy, as well as the SADC climate change strategy and action plan for addressing environmental management and for sustainable development. So should we, there is a plethora of law. Africa is endowed with laws and policies. But if we are to look into the second strand of your question, whether to say, is there political will? I can safely say that there is a political will in terms of putting in place national laws. I think our governments are slowly coming to the table and waking up to the reality of the impact of climate change. For example, we have Kenya that has promulgated a Climate Change Act. South Africa is actually in its advanced stages of drafting the Climate Change Act for South Africa, while countries such as Malawi, Zimbabwe, and Lesotho also have comprehensive policies and legislation on climate change. And the Zimbabwe one is progressive because it really zeroes in on the critical role that children and youth play as agents of change in terms of addressing climate change. And we can also see Zimbabwe including climate change aspects in its curriculum development for education. And this has also been done in Lesotho and Malawi. However, political will becomes very questionable when we start talking about climate financing. And this not only talks about the allocation of resources, but the efficiency of spending. And I'm really excited that there's a speaker that will also be zeroing in on climate financing. But we see that there's really limited political will on putting where our money is. And it's very important that as our countries are drafting what we call the National Determined Contributions, NDCs, at the UN level, where they are committing to addressing carbon emissions and to actually also include indigenous practices for addressing climate change, that they put the unnecessary financing frameworks to implement these policies. We also really need to build cleaner and safer cities. And we see that this hasn't really been something that is on the government radar, as well as an education curriculum overall to ensure that climate change is something that is really taught even at ECD level, all up to tertiary level. So we really need to address the issue of implementation of the laws we have, but also to ensure that there is adequate financing to address them. So Shumi, from a legal perspective, laws are there in some countries, some progressive. However, the political will becomes questionable when we are now trying to put in the systems and structures to give effect to the laws that exist. And I'd like to close before my 5 minutes end on the question around credibility. Definitely, if our African governments have committed to an Africa that is self-sufficient, an Africa that is led by its peoples, and when we are talking about African issues and African solutions to African problems, I really like what one of the speakers in the video was saying, that this is a pandemic and it's a human and development imperative. And leaders need to understand that it's not only about credibility, but it's also about a legacy. So it's a development imperative in terms of addressing climate change, but it also is a socio-economic imperative for our governments. Children and young people will inherit the consequences of climate change, and yet they're the least responsible for emitting carbon emissions, for any of the greenhouse effects we are seeing. And we know that the economic cost of inaction are very significant. It is currently estimated that $8 trillion will be lost between now and 2050 due to the environmental damage that will be caused by climate change. And this analysis done by the UN actually shows that those who will be mostly affected are children, young people, and women, as rightfully mentioned by Mishek Kondo. So it's both a human development imperative, it's a socio-economic imperative, but ultimately it's also about us as Africans. We really need to put in place where the necessary finances, we need to put in place the necessary systems so that our young people, as they were saying in the videos, inherit a clean continent where they can also then focus on ensuring that they are also transitioning the same environment to their young in the future. So I'll end by saying that we really need to influence at the COP27 the need for these national determined contributions to really speak into the voices of young people, and that young people contribute to this space in terms of really calling for these laws that are in place to actually be in place, but also for the African Union to place an instructive document, and young people through SAYOF, through a lot of youth movements, can really speak to the African Union Commission to say our governments need a committed document which they can commit to to address the climate crisis. Thanks a lot, Shumi. Over.
Thank you so much, Yvonne, for that very detailed response. I'm not shocked by that. I forgot to mention for the people online, Yvonne has a master's in law and she's now doing her doctorate. So when she speaks, it's the gospel. So thank you for really providing us with such a detailed legal framework. And for also, I think sometimes it's good to hear about the good practices, the best practices that are going on in the continent. So, you mentioned Kenya, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, and how Zimbabwe, Lesotho, and Malawi are now implementing climate change into their curriculum. That's really great news. But I think, as to what I really saw that you mentioned were a lot of really beautiful and great policies, which I think I always struggle with as an African, because even when I'm defending the South African Constitution, it's beautiful, but really the implementation of it is very poor. So we have these beautiful policies, but what do we do? What is the gap that we need to fill to ensure that there's actually obligations? We know that heads of state and nations are supposed to report on how they implement, but they actually don't. And what are the repercussions of that? Do you get a fine? Are there penalties? What happens if states are not adequately reporting? Because that becomes the gap. We have a situation where we have all the laws and no implementation, and then that's where the problem comes in. And when they say, if you want to be successful, find a problem that needs fixing. So as the youth, that's the problem we need to fix. Are we going to come together and say, all right, so there are the laws, but no one is actually forcing member states or states to report on this. We're going to actually, as youth, amplify that and make sure and hold them accountable for that. So thank you so much, Yvonne, for that one. I will then move on to Mr. Mukasiri Sibanda. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Shumirai, and it's a big privilege, I think, to be part of this important conversation. Can I ask how many minutes do I have?
5 minutes, Mukasiri. I know you. Please, you have 5 minutes.
Yeah. I thought we should agree. But we are talking about finance. Inflation is another issue with finance. So can we inflate that to 8 minutes?
6.
All right. So I started by saying I like Makadzi, the Chinjamagia. So we listened to the two speakers, and now we're talking about finance. So allow me, if I were with you physically, I would have shown you some of the dancing skills of changing the gears in this conversation. But since I'm online, at least you have missed out. So let me start by saying, I don't want to use the word financing, deliberately so, because history has shown that when slavery was abolished, the pangs of slavery, it is the slave owners who were compensated, not the slaves, not those that suffered injustice. In the case of Haiti, they paid it is the slaves who compensated the slave owners. Then we move on to colonialism. You said we gained independence. Look at Zimbabwe. Now we are paying white farmers for taking back the land. We are now talking about climate injustice. Africa has no role to play in terms of this crisis, did not contribute to this crisis that we are faced with now. It is multinational corporations, it is the economies of the global north that accumulated wealth by disregarding the cost in terms of the planet and the people so that they maximize their profit. That's how the financial ecosystem, the global financial ecosystem is sculptured. So I think we should be talking about reparations. The polluter pays principle. We had a lawyer who contributed earlier on. This is when we say polluter pays principle, we are coming from the acknowledgement that there is a wrong that has been done, and there is a responsibility to respect, to redress some of the injustices that we are facing. Right. So let me sanitize the conversation now to climate financing. To start with, there is a conflation when we talk about climate financing and just transition financing. With the climate financing, the major focus area there is decarbonization. How do we put measures that promote mitigation, adaptation, and a more resilient economy? But when we look at just transition finance, we are now more people-centered. We are now more about the protection of those that are vulnerable, those that are living in poverty. How do we come up with a mechanism in light of the vagaries of climate change to make sure that their livelihoods are protected? If you talk about in Mpumalanga, as the case of South Africa, directly 100,000 people are employed in coal mining, and indirectly those that are in the SMEs, you can see the multiplier effect. They tend to lose their jobs. How do we reskill them? How do we ensure that they've got alternative sources of employment and decent work? So these are the issues that are at the core of this conversation. And ordinarily, when we talk about financing, we start to talk about it from, if you talk about it in a private sector investment, you don't start talking about financing, you start talking about investment. What our investment needs when we talk about climate change. So those are things that we need to list down. And it's surely, if you look at them and also understanding that they are not pulled out, they are mainstreamed within the broader sustainable development indicators. Like when you talk about food security, when you talk about access to water, when you talk about clean environment, when you talk about the right to life and so forth. So you don't talk about climate financing in a dislocated conversation to the functionality of the public financial management framework, which is meant to deliver the maximum public advantage to the people. So my point here is the demand side is huge. Look at the baseline. Africa is choking in debt. Look at the baseline. Africa, the resources that we need to finance your basic service delivery, which demand side is also grown because of climate, because of the adverse climate and weather conditions that are becoming more frequent. We are also talking about worsening unemployment. We are talking about in the context of growing poverty and inequality. So the demand for public services, yes, risen exponentially, but yet Africa is choking in debt. Africa is choking as a result of illicit financial flows. We are losing, according to the latest report from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, 89 billion annually. And look at the pledge that is coming from the developed countries to finance climate from the Paris Agreement, 100 billion that they are failing to fulfill. So if we flip this, if we have got a fairer global political and economic architecture, which does not stifle the domestic resource mobilization capabilities of the global South, Africa, in this being the center of this conversation, and the SADC region, KB illicit financial flows, we have got a fair start in terms of Africa standing on its own right now to protect the vulnerable in society. So generally, climate financing refers to the sources of finance that are coming from the public sector, from the private sector, and all other innovative instruments that are there at local, at national, at continental, and international level. And what is also worrying in terms of the risk is that part of the financing uses debt as an instrument. So we have debt which comes in terms of the ecological debt because of climate change. We also have got, we are now borrowing again to try to transition. You understand? These are the key risks. But just to say one point as I conclude, the conversation about climate financing and just energy financing, they should be different from the conversations that we're having in the global South, or in SADC region right now. They should be different from the conversation that we're having, that the global North are having. Because though we are facing the same storm, but we are using different boats. Some are in the cruisers, but some of us were in canoes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mukasiri, and I think you were very true to time there. So thank you for that. And I think you really left me with a beautiful principle quote, which I love quotes. The polluter pays the principal. I think that's such a powerful, powerful quote. And I think that also then begs the question, is Africa ready for, this climate transition, this just transition? And why should we be forced, into this transition when our core and root issues have not even addressed, haven't been addressed yet? And then I think as the youth, we really need to go to COP27 and say, you know what? If you as the global north, the emitters, are failing to even pay 100 billion, how do we put you to task? And how do we say, no, if you can't even pay this, how are you going to not pay us for 89 billion we're losing per year? And the debt continues and continues and continues. And I think just to mention something that happened to me at the alternative mining in Daba, where I raised a question to a big mining corporate. I won't name names. And next to the big corporate was IMF, I think, the sister organization for World Bank. And they were saying to me, no, don't worry, we're going to give you guys a loan. And I said, what loan do you want to give us now? Because at this stage, not even my great-grandchildren will be able to live in a loan-free Africa. So we need to address that going forward and make that a very, very topical and poignant point at COP27. So thank you so much, Mukasiri. I will now move to Ms. Bupe Banda. Bupe, you can take the floor. Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot, Tony. I think this is the first webinar that I'm joining with the climate issues. I've missed the previous ones, but most importantly, I'm happy that you decided to bring CBNRM into the discussion. So I work with communities, I work for the communities, and my contribution today will be much of a perspective from the community side of things. So I'm trying to look at how climate change has really affected the communities and natural resource management. When the issues of climate change became global, when everybody was talking about them, it was really difficult to marry them with conservation. I think it's only recently that studies, some research, and also conversations are actually trying to see that the impacts and the effects are actually interrelated. And it's more so when you go at a community level. I'd love to say that communities are the most affected when it comes to the impacts of climate change. I'm not saying that the people that are living in the urban areas are not affected, but I'm saying communities are the most affected. And I say so because in most cases, communities are not prepared for the disasters that come along due to the effects of climate change. They are also not ready financially to quickly recover as compared to somebody who's in an urban area. So the way a person in Nabwalia Chiefdom of Zambia will be affected and the way a person who is in Lusaka will be affected will be two different scenarios, because one of them will easily recover, the other one will not easily recover. And because of that, we see that communities are suffering most. Climate change has affected them. When we have droughts, we see that the droughts will cause the communities to have to migrate, because they have to move to where there will be food security. They have to move where they will be able to access water. And this migration does not only happen on the part of humans, the animals too will migrate. And we know that in Southern Africa, wildlife is like what drives the economies of our rural communities. So when wildlife is also migrating, people are migrating, they'll move to areas where both of them might even be vulnerable, because we have instances where they've moved to areas where they're closer to each other, increasing the cases of human-wildlife conflict. And we well know that we do not have proper compensation policies when it comes to human-wildlife conflict. So human-wildlife conflicts have gone to an extent of crop damage and even the loss of lives. So in this case, we see that the communities are losing out on their livelihoods. They are also losing out on their property. They are losing out on their infrastructure, and they are also losing their lives. So it's like a cycle. It comes from the simple effect of drought. They have to migrate to a better place. human wildlife comes into play. And at the end of the day, there's no one to really compensate them or address the problem. In a case that it is not a drought, but maybe it's a flood, almost a similar pattern will happen, because when there are floods, their houses will be destroyed. They were not ready, they were not prepared. They still have to move to upper lands. Their crops are damaged. They will not have food. There'll be food shortages. There'll be diseases, because we know that when there's so much water, that becomes also a mode of transmitting some diseases. So there will be outbreaks, there will be cholera, people will die, and any other thing that comes along with that. But we know that communities at the end of the day are also not having easy access to health services as compared to somebody in the urban areas. So we see that all this is actually putting the communities at the vulnerable side of the effects of climate change. We know that a lot is being done by them to actually adapt, but at the end of the day, they are not managing to do everything at the same time or at a rate in which they can respond to the rate at which these effects are actually coming. Sometimes they have wildfires. These wildfires will affect the animals. The animals will actually lose their habitat. They'll have to move to other areas. So it's a whole lot of confusion happening, and then the communities are left there to make decisions, to see how they can actually move. And we get back to the table and say, okay, policymakers, people who want to address climate change, where do we marry conservation? Where do we marry climate change? And where do we marry the communities and everything that is happening? And I'm actually happy that conversations such as these ones are actually bringing into discussion what should actually happen. I was looking at the priorities of COP27, and I have seen that the second priority is something to do with adaptation to protect communities and natural habitats through building of defenses, warning systems, and resilient infrastructure and agriculture to avoid loss of homes and livelihoods and even lives. So I'm looking forward to what will happen in Egypt. I'm looking forward to see the outcome of the conversations, the high-level panel discussions that will actually involve the communities. Discussions that will bring the communities and the youth together so that they can bring their voices there. They are the most affected. They are the ones that are living with these natural resources that all of us want to talk about. Climate change is not leaving them out. So we want to see how the outcomes of COP27 will actually translate into implementable national level and local level policies, which will have communities on the actors and the youth on the actors. We do not want declarations and statements that will just end in Egypt. We want everybody to bring them back home. We want those policies, those declarations to be brought back in Zambia and see how the youth can contribute to achieving those goals. You asked about what the youth are doing. There are so many initiatives that are actually happening. I like categorizing the youth into two categories, especially in Zambia. We have the youth that are based in the urban areas, the ones that are going to universities, the ones that are studying. And we also have on the other end, the youth who are based in the communities, the ones who are working hand in hand with our elders to take care of our natural resources, to take care of our trees, to take care of our rivers, the fish, and the wildlife itself. So we have those that are living in the communities and those that are living in town. But their involvement is not seen. In the recent past, I have attended some multilateral environmental agreement conventions such as CITES, IUCN, and also the just ended APAC, which happened last month. It happened in Kigali. And we can see that a lot of effort is being made by the youth to actually mobilize themselves, to coordinate themselves and be positioned to contribute to policy, to contribute to actions and be on the ground to actually implement. So Shumirai, a lot is happening. There are so many initiatives that are happening and projects. We have some youths who are advocating for green energy. We have some who are advocating for smart agriculture as a way of mitigating the impacts of climate change and also ensuring that there's food security for the communities who are most affected. We have some who are doing research. These ones are the ones that are studying at universities, the ones that are in town, the ones that are in Osaka like myself, the ones that are working in different organizations and CSOs. So they are doing a lot of research to inform policy and decision making in our governments. We also have some who are mobilizing themselves in form of movements. And I believe SAT is also amongst those different organizations who are ensuring that this coordination is happening. But I must also be quick to mention that the individual efforts that are coming from these youth movements and these youth groups at a national and local level are actually happening in silos. So I'll actually challenge all the youths, including myself, to work together, starting from a national level, we take it to a regional level, and then we take it to an international level. If we want to be involved, if we want the elders to respect us and to see that our contribution towards whatever is being discussed is valuable, then they have to see that we are more organized, starting from a local level until an international level. A lot is happening. It just needs to be coordinated well. It needs to be documented well. And at the same time, it needs to be respected by our elders, by policymakers, by governments. Because at the end of the day, what we want is to address climate change impact. We know that COP27, just like these other multilateral environmental agreements, is going to set targets which have to be achieved in the next few years. But who will be there to implement and actually face the impacts of those decisions? It's actually the youth of today. And this is why we are very important. So Shumirai, as you prepare the roadmap, as you prepare the conversations and everybody to go to Egypt, make sure that you bring in the youth, not only those that are in town. Pick some from the villages. Their voices matter also in this issue because they are also affected. And they are doing a lot that has to be seen in Egypt and also at all tables that will be making decisions. I'll end here for now. Unless I'll be given another chance, I'll talk again.
Thank you so much, Abubu, for those beautiful insights. I think, you know, I could not have had this conversation without your inputs because CBNRM, I don't know for what reason, but happens to be overlooked when it's really at the core of the disasters that happen. They don't really happen in the suburbs. Durban, I think, recently with the floods was the first one where actually the suburbs were kind of feeling it. But most of the damage took place in villages and rural areas. So to discount communities it doesn't make any sense. And I also raised this at the philanthropic conference that, you know, I'm also at a stage where I don't want to go into these environments with everybody with having a master's degree, everyone being a climate expert. It's not really touching on the ground level, the grassroots level issues. We need to include not just youth, but people from the real communities that we're wanting to help, because they're the ones who actually know and are actually developing programs to help combat these issues that are currently being faced. And as you said again, and I think we keep seeing a space for youth to fit, and you said, who is going to implement these things once all our presidents come back and they go back to the state house? Who's going to do it? No one. We have to do it for ourselves because it's our future. Otherwise, we have no future. And really, I think you've highlighted a very critical point, and I think it feeds into what is the African agenda? What are we going to say? We can't just go there as paupers and be like, okay, we'll take 500 billion from you, we'll do this. It doesn't make sense, because are we really ready? Are our communities ready to move from firewood? They're not. To solar, they're not, because they don't have the money and the resources. So is Africa ready? And if we are not ready, how do we go to COP and put forth an African agenda to say, okay, we're not ready right now, but this is what we need to do. This is when we will be ready, and we're going to do it at our own pace, with our own funding measures, and submit that to the global north. Because soon we're going to enter what we're going to see as the next scramble for Africa, where we've seen Russia blew up things in Europe, and now everyone's going to come to, DRC, to Zimbabwe, to all these mineral-rich countries to come and now scramble everything, leave a big mess, and leave us in even more, danger. So we really need to focus on what the Africa agenda is and how we take that forward. So thank you so much, Bupe. And lastly, I will open the floor to Lieberman. Bebe, you can take the floor, please.
Thank you, Shumirai, and thanks to everyone who has joined this conversation. And thank you to my fellow panelists for the contributions that have been made so far. I want to begin my presentation in response to your question by restating a few things that have already been stated by my fellow panelists, but also that were stated by young people that were interviewed in the video. The first thing that I really want to say is that, and noting from the contributions so far, is that climate change is an intergenerational, intersectional, interracial, intercontinental, and non-discriminatory crisis that is requiring urgent and immediate remedial action. And that young people across the planet, and more particularly within sub-Saharan Africa, are among the most affected populations. That they face the double tragedy of being the generation that will both be affected by climate change and bear the burden of finding solutions to it. Consequently, they need to be at the center of the debates and solutions to this global crisis. And because decision-making on climate change will have far-reaching impacts, we need to see young people being active agents of change and playing a central role in shaping the debate on climate change. So, having said this, there has been a lot of studies, surveys that have been done that have argued that young people are not present when it comes to the climate change debate, that in fact they have chosen to be absent. And I think in the question, you do talk about youth despondency and youth lack of participation. In responding to that question, let me start by answering and breaking down the remaining part of my presentation into three. The first thing is I want to talk into why are young people not participating? And then I will move on to talk what is it that we want to see young people do? And then lastly, talk about how do we ensure that these young people are doing what we expect them to do. Firstly, young people are not participating because they lack adequate knowledge. They have not been sufficiently equipped with information that helps them to understand the impacts of climate change and how these impacts relate to their day-to-day existence. They lack opportunities for participation. They are excluded generally from formal policy decision-making processes. Young people suffer from poverty and vulnerability, which forces them to focus largely on survival rather than looking at long-term impacts. They suffer from what I will term adultism, where adults believe that they can act better for the benefit of young people, and therefore eventually results in young people being seen and not heard. Adults are taking the center stage. They are not allowing young people to play their role. They are not allowing young people to make their input. They think that they can act, they can say, and they can legislate on behalf of young people without the express involvement of young people. And ultimately, we see that young people lack support, they lack mentorship. They do not have opportunities to support their actions. They do not have mentors to help them through in understanding some of these challenges. And lastly, I would say that young people lack adequate resources to actually sponsor their participation in the entire global climate crisis debate. So what is it that we want to see young people do? What is it that we want to see young people do? I think we need to see an increase in youth voices towards climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, and climate change financing. We need to see civil society push for more voices of young people so that we can make Sharma El-Sheikh more youthful, so that we make Sharma El-Sheikh more about implementation rather than more about more and more promises. We need young people to play an active role in pushing world leaders, and in particular putting governments to meet their part of the bargain. World leaders must be held accountable for their commitments to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. More than accountability, we also now need actions that are pushing world leaders to commit to legislating their commitments rather than leaving them merely and largely as discretionary. I think we have seen from the first COP in 1994 up to now that world leaders have been making commitments, but the challenge is that no one is holding them accountable to these commitments. I think Mukasiri did talk about the $100 billion commitment to climate financing, which I think was supposed to kick in 2020, but this is 2022. Nothing has been done to meet that. We have seen countries commit to nationally determined contributions to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but nothing is being done to meet those demands. We have seen countries in the global north committing to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We have seen them committing to reducing their carbon footprint, but nothing is being done. I think this is what has informed the reactions by countries in the global south to begin to say, why should we be the ones that are committing? Why should we be the ones? Where is the justice in all this? We have seen countries like China and India refusing to actually make immediate commitments. So from COP26 in Glasgow, where the Glasgow Climate Pact was the first ever climate deal to explicitly commit world leaders to reducing their over-reliance on coal. We now need to move from COP26 to practical steps towards legislating these commitments so that citizens in the countries are able to hold leaders to be more accountable. So from Glasgow to Sharma El-Sheikh, there is a need for more policy clarity. There is a need for legislative commitments. There is a need for citizens to demand that their governments, that bilateral agencies, that multilateral agencies are held accountable for the commitments that they have made. Just to put it out there, even if all the countries in the world commit to fulfilling their nationally determined contributions, it has been shown by studies that we will still fail to meet the target of reducing global temperatures or maintaining global temperatures below 1.5 degrees. In fact, if all countries commit to fulfilling their nationally determined contributions, then we will only reach the target of 2.4 degrees in terms of increase in global temperature. So that means that we have a crisis, and this crisis needs urgent and immediate remedial action. So we need to see more countries in the global north act on their commitments. We need to see more countries in the global south also act on their commitments. We need to see China and India move away from their non-committal stance. We need to see the global north committing to reducing methane gas emissions by 30% by 2030 as previously committed. So we need all players, all hands in the deck. And in order to achieve this, we need young people to be at the center stage of this whole debate, these whole discussions on climate change. Why? Because young people will be the ones that will be there in the future to experience the negative, the disastrous impact of climate change. So young people must be at the driving seat of shifting of the climate change debate, and shifting not only from climate adaptation, but shifting from climate adaptation to climate resilience. And we need to develop new strategies of ensuring that these young people are participating. Because we have said that young people are not participating, but why are they not participating? And how can we make them participate? So as I drive towards the last part of my presentation, we need to strengthen and establish national forums that are aimed at expanding youth engagement in climate change initiatives within the SADC region in particular, and generally throughout our planet. We need more young people creating spaces where they control the agenda. We need more young people inventing spaces where they control the agenda. Young people playing a leading, central, and critical role in shaping the agenda of climate change discourse within their communities. We need more spaces like these where young people are participating and the adults take the right not to participate. We want more spaces like these where young people are determining the form and the direction to which the debate on climate change needs to. So we need young people to create spaces. When I'm saying creating spaces, I'm saying we need more conferences organized by young people. We need more side events organized by young people. We need more educative platforms organized by young people. We need more policy platforms organized by young people to shape the discussion, the debate on policy, on climate change. In these platforms, we need to see young people inviting policymakers. We need to see young people involving legislators. We need to see young people involving multilateral and bilateral institutions. We need to see private players being involved. And in these conversations, we need to begin to see young people influencing the change that they want to see. We need to see young people beginning to be the drivers of the change that they want to see. We need to promote strategies that influence greater social media presence and greater social media debates. Young people now are on social media. Young people are on Twitter, they are on WhatsApp, they are on Facebook, they are on TikTok, they are on Instagram. We need to have these conversations taken to these spaces where young people are. We need these conversations to be taken to the places where young people are more comfortable in participating. We know that on Twitter, there is no amount of intimidation that can stop young people from expressing themselves. We know that on Facebook, a young woman can freely express themselves. We know obviously that there are usually challenges with our social media as a result. It resulted in trying to intimidate, reduce the impact and effectiveness of women's participation, the impact and effectiveness of youth participation. But with those weaknesses, social media still presents far much better opportunities for young people to participate, to express themselves, These are spaces where young people have control. These are spaces where young people are found. And these are spaces where we need to continuously promote engagement with policymakers. You see, young people on social media spaces reduce the distance that exists between them and policymakers. I am able through a tweet to interact with a minister. I am able through a tweet to interact with a UN envoy. I'm able through a tweet to interact with the regional, with national, regional, and international policymakers. And therefore, we need to promote the use of social media in promoting youth participation in the climate change debate. We need more young people that are generally engaged in social media circles to even cut, you know, what we know and what we have come across is that sub-Saharan Africa has a mix of authoritarian and at least liberally democratic regimes. And authoritarian regimes have survived through curtailing citizen voices. And when we use social media, we are able to ensure that even those regimes that have privatized public media, those regimes that have monopolized public media are able to, citizens in those kind of regimes are able to express themselves, they are able to share their opinions. We need to identify youth champions who are young people that can be key drivers of change. By youth champions, I'm referring to young artists, I'm referring to young politicians, I'm referring to youth activists, I'm referring to social media influencers who can be used to drive key messages from young people, who can be used to drive messages that will ensure that global leaders, world leaders will stop and listen to the messages that are coming from young people. So we need to look at various strategies of employing youth champions, of employing the use of youth champions. We need to change young people's attitudes towards climate change. A lot of our young people do not have interest in climate change issues, in environmental issues. They think that they are peripheral to their day-to-day survival. Yet they are the generation that is experiencing the harsh impacts of climate change. They are the generation that is experiencing the impact of changes in weather. They are the generation that is being affected by floods. They are the generation that is being affected by high rises in temperatures, but they still think that this is peripheral. So we need actions that will change the attitudes, that will change their attitudes, so that we can develop a more positive attitude among young people on climate change and bring them onto the table as drivers for change. We want young people that are going to be the drivers for change on climate change issues. We need to expose our young people to more capacity building opportunities so that they are able to sponsor meaningful participation, both at the policy and also at implementation level. So we need our young people well capacitated to be able to be active participants. And we need to push for opportunities for young people to be involved in the actual talks, not for young people to be involved in the peripheral conversations. We have seen that in previous conferences of the parties, we've seen young people marching, we've seen young people demonstration, we've seen young people involved in side conversations, and they are not being brought into the actual talks. We need young people on the table, on the actual talks, so that they begin to influence the real tangible outcomes of climate change conversations that are happening. We need to build local, regional, and global solidarity, where between and among young people in the global north and in the global south, the solidarity must result in strengthening climate change movements in ways that will achieve greater accountability. Young people sitting in the United States of America who are suing the United States government for failing to commit to practical steps to reduce its carbon footprint must be able to connect with young people in Johannesburg, South Africa, who are educating communities about the negative impacts of climate change. So we need to have global solidarity that will enable us as young people to demand greater accountability. And lastly, we need more research. We need research that is centered on understanding the perspectives of young people on climate change. We need young people to contribute to major researches. And in my conclusion, to achieve all this, we need to have a new kind of leadership in Africa. We need a new kind of leadership in SADC, a leadership that is in conversation with its citizens, a leadership that is talking to its citizens, a leadership that does not talk at its citizens, but is in constant dialogue with its citizens. We need a leadership that understands that it will benefit from the rich ecosystem of innovative solutions that come out of deliberative democracy processes. So in my conclusion, our sub-Saharan Africa, SADC needs a new kind of leadership that will promote youth conversation, youth dialogue, and primarily push towards youth involvement and inclusion in climate change debate. Thank you so much. I will wait for questions or contributions. Otherwise, thank you so much. I will end here.
Thank you so much for your contributions, very detailed and articulate, Lieberman, for that. If I can just ask those on the call just to bear with us and just give us 10 minutes. We're just running slightly over. We don't want to stop speakers. They're giving such relevant and important points. I think I'm going to reference Mukasiri, who has to leave us shortly. Mukasiri mentioned Makadzi, and Makadzi has a song called Mjolo. So I think as the youth, we need to stop focusing on those Mjolo things and use our social media for more, purposeful activities for now, and use it, proactively. I think that was one of the points that he raised, that we literally own social media. People pay rent with social media. Why not use it for something very, very great? And at the forum, there was a speaker who said, the youth suffer from everything. You guys don't have jobs. It's climate change. You're single. You have every issue in the world, which is true. But if we have every issue, how do we work together now to really work on the things that we can work on? And we have the space, we have the capacity, we have the know-how. Young Africans are brilliant. Maybe we're forced to by our parents, but we really are. And we should use that brilliance to really take it to the top and really, really make sure that we can address these issues. And really, I would want to see a youth in Egypt not going to Egypt to do what they've done, because even what happened in COP27, nothing happened, if we're being quite honest. So let's make this African COP something where something is actionable. So when we go to the UAE next year for COP28, we can say, as the African youth, we did this and we actioned this. And our governments and our state leaders did 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I'll quickly go to the questions, and then I'll just give maybe 2 minutes for people whose hands are raised. So a lot of the questions were answered. So thank you to participants. I see Yvonne got quite a lot of questions there, and she's endeavored to answer them on the chat. So colleagues, you can go onto the chat and see those responses and those interactions as well. Then there's a question for Mishek here. From Malvin Dakar. He says, thanks Gondo for the insight. What is the response of the government in curbing climate change in Zimbabwe? And what are you doing in terms of resource allocation and skills development? Then he goes to mention mining activities in Hwange and Chiredzi and other parts of the country, and what the gaps are in terms of youth and women and how they're increasing. And then, oh, unfortunately, my resident French translator is not here. So please, we do apologize unless Rodden can quickly translate his French comment into English. But unfortunately, I'm not able to translate that. Then Ryan Timothy says, COP27 will definitely be a good starting point for young people to express their views and launch their ideas. And are there any platforms available for one to register for the event and attend at a minimal cost? Then there's Tembegile Maseko, who says, interesting insights, Liberman, but I worry #activism has not yielded much action on the ground in Africa. How do you suggest the youths translate the hashtags into action, considering they seemingly still excluded from the table of action? Then we have Richard Andrew, who says, with the invasion of Ukraine, it is alleged that some of these rich countries have switched on the coal plants for electricity with statements that they've committed to reducing emissions. They simply do what's best for their economies, and so the people of Africa will be left fighting poverty. Should Africa also focus on getting rich and later also start committing to zero emissions after it's able to finance this crisis on its own, which I think speaks to the point that kept being raised throughout our conversations, whether we are ready for this just transition. And then I'll just look, I think there's one hand up from Max Munyemburiko. I don't know if Max, I'll give you permission to talk. Are you still on the call?
Yes, I'm still on the call. Good afternoon, and thank you, moderator, for the opportunity given, and also inviting me to be part of this crucial meeting. I'm from Namibia, specific in the Kavango East region, where we are also being a target for extractive industry. And climate change also is one of the issue with on the ground. Yeah, our community, as I'm from the remote area communities where we have lack of knowledge and skills on the human rights and the other relevant regulation that can help us also to stand on our own, or to stand ourselves and say to the government, please, governments, lawmakers, politicians, decision makers, let us be also put in our view or input on whatever decision that you are taking that will be beneficiary to us, the people on the ground, because our community or our peoples on the ground, they are voiceless and they are very far from the urban areas. Whatever decision that are being taken, they don't include us. Our voices is not heard. Then I wanted to know to the lawyer Yvonne, how maybe can we make sure our government to be held accountable so that they can implement the policy and other laws which is within within us, so that they can honor and respect the human rights and the human dignity when coming to projects that are one of that can also carbon products that is distracting the ozone layer and also creating pollutions, being underground water pollutions, air pollutions, and also it gives health hazard to our people. That is what I wanted to know. How can we hold accountable to our government so that they can hear our concern, hear our voice, respect our input, or respect our rights? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Max, for that input. I think I'll allow the panelists to answer that question. So there's just one more comment here from Neva Mujere saying the young people are real game changers if given space to act. I completely agree with that one. Thanks for the input. And thank you, Max, for attending the dialogue. So panelists, I'm going to ask that you please respond. Some of the questions are general, some of them were specifically directed to certain panelists, but I'm giving you 2 minutes maximum. If you can do it in a minute, I'd appreciate, so we can wrap up and close. Thank you so much. I'll start with Mishek.
Thank you very much, Shumi, for this. Let me start to respond to Marvin. Indeed, one of the things that we need to take into account as young people and as residents of any country in the SADC region is to make sure that we hold the government accountable on natural resource governance, especially on extraction of resources. We've seen a number of issues, including what he mentioned in Wage, whereby some of the corporates are coming, other nationalities are coming in terms of even destroying the heritage. I think we need to come together in any country, even what has been said from Namibia, in different institutions, CSO, regional organizations, and hold government accountable to make sure that we preserve this and everything that is being done does not affect the communities. Then on the second point on capacity building, it is very important, Marvin, because capacity building is key. When I started to present, I said at regional level, we are rolling out capacity building initiative in the SADC region, and quite also that Zimbabwe is among the first 3 countries, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Mozambique. So you can get in touch in terms of inclusion, both capacity building at your community level, but also at national level. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mishek, for those inputs, and I hope, Marvin, your questions were answered. Yvonne?
Thank you so much, Shumirai. And just to take off from where Mishek left, and in response to Christabel, definitely Christabel, our governments are inundated with a lot of accountability issues, particularly when it comes to service provisions for social and economic rights. And then coupled with COVID-19, we already know that we are far beyond some of the commitments that we've made. But as mentioned by Mukasiri, climate change financing shouldn't be viewed as a very big elephant in the room. It should be embedded within the public finance management system. And this can be either when you are allocating funds, for example, in the education system, how much of it is actually going for curriculum development to address the provision of climate change classes in the school curriculum. When we look into how they address issues around taxation, how are they actually taxing corporates and big companies that actually come to invest in a country. So there's definitely very innovative ways that governments can use to mobilize additional resources to address climate change. And also the issue of blended financing strategies, using the public funds to actually ensure that they are attracting more private sector investments, and a percentage of that actually going into addressing climate change issues. While I really like the polluter pays principle, I think our African governments really need to really pay attention to the issue of accountability. Otherwise, we get to a point where the principle receives the payment, but these funds are not efficiently used. So as spoken by the last speaker, we really need a change in Africa around our governance mechanisms, and to actually have leaders that have a heart for people, and we address issues such as corruption, tax havens, and tax holidays, that a lot of the private sectors that are benefiting from our resources are used because our governments do not have the necessary systems and policing structures. Max, I really like the idea around community engagement, and Africa is also really endowed with a lot of domestic and indigenous knowledge of addressing climate change. For example, time immemorial, we've been using the issues of reclaiming the rallies. And as a region, we need to really engage the communities and harness domestic and indigenous knowledge on addressing climate change. But when it comes to holding governments to account, this is the role the civil society plays at a national level. Let's be very deliberate in assessing what our governments are committing to at global and regional level and hold them to accountable. We can also use the national human rights institutions to start having test cases where we actually put to test governments in terms of what they failed to do in terms of protecting children and young people, or to protecting the environment, and using the human rights commissions to raise some human rights abuses that come out from climate change dealings within the country. But we also have entry points through the Universal Periodic Review, where we can also advocate as civil society organizations when our country is under review for the UN mechanisms to actually address and ask our questions, the extent to which they are implementing climate change priorities that have set. And then at the African Union level, we also have the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, where our African governments actually submit state-party reports. And in those state-party reports, they really need to be held accountable in terms of explaining the extent to which they've actually implemented Article 21 of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. So there's so many avenues which we can hold our governments accountable, but we really need to have visibility of what commitments they've put in, really raise awareness with communities, with young people, so that when we now meet them in public spaces, we can actually say, in 2022, you did say that you are putting 2% of the annual budget towards environmental management. Where have we gone? So let's get access to these information so that we use both the global, regional, and national mechanisms to hold our governments to account. It is possible, although the global north also has a role to play as African solutions to African problems. Thanks, Shumi.
Thank you, Yvonne. You spoke like a lawyer in the courtroom. So you hit all the points. Thank you so much for those detailed responses. Mukasiri, I'm not sure if you're still with us. You said you were going to drop off. I don't know if you have any last minute comments or responses.
Yeah, number one, what we have learned from the COVID-19 and generally is that we are living in a global village. The challenges that we are facing of financing at country level, much as yes, we would want to put focus and pressure on our government, which of course we should, but let us understand we are in a global financial system and the rules are not made by Africa. So if you read the high-level panel report on illicit financial flows from Africa that was led by His Excellency Thabo Mbeki, Africa then in 2015 was losing more than 50 billion to illicit financial flows. 65% of their responsibility, the culprits, the major thieves, are multinational corporations that dominate the economies of developing countries. So we can't have a discussion which talks about enhancing domestic resource mobilization capabilities of African countries without looking at how America makes its laws to make it easier for profits to be shifted from Africa. Is the in terms of the financial secrecy, that's the number one. We can't Africa, as much as we can make our own laws, Switzerland can come up with is a tax haven. We don't have jurisdiction over that. So for me, it's important. Let's pin down our governments, but let's also forget that this game is beyond us. It's a global, we need a global political will to tackle our challenges. Then secondly, I don't think we need to shy away from polluter pays principle. We need to say this is a matter of reparations. And the youth particularly, if you miss that point from slavery, from colonialism, I tell you, Africa right now, look at the value creation, the percentage contribution from Africa on manufacturing. It's less than I think it's 2% of the global contribution to the manufacturing sector. And manufacturing is about value addition. So our economies, we are poor as we speak right now to mobilize the resources. And we are pinned down to make sure to a stage where we are confined to the bottom of the value chain, global value chain. How do we move up? without addressing some of the investment, trade, debt, tax injustices that are not of our own making. So for me, the bigger picture is very, very important, and that we should not drop the ball. And the youth must lead that. If we are talking about the youth dividend, that is elusive, we should also view it in terms of how is the youth a performing asset for transparency and accountability and for government system, for creativity and so forth. That's it on my end. And thank you very much for the opportunity. And I've learned a lot through this discussion.
Thank you so much, Mukasiri. I don't think anyone will be going to bed tonight without thinking about the polluter pays the price. We'll be thinking about that before we close our eyes. So thank you for that. Bupe, over to you for any comments.
Thanks, Shumi. I tried to go through the questions and I see that none was actually directed to me, but I see that there's one from Tembekile, which is talking about hashtag activism and how this can translate into action, especially that the youth are already excluded from the table of climate action. I just want to say that the world is going digital, and the youth just have to be ready to also go digital. We are actually already using these gadgets. We just have to make sure that we are using these tools to also advance the change that we want to see. We can use these by also advancing all the ideas and our inputs that we want to see. We can use these to also lobby for positions or outcomes that we would love to see in the policies that are being made. We can also use them to actually come up with some campaigns that would use to advocate for policy change at an international level, at a national level, and even a local level. Yes, the space is not always there. And in the past, we have been saying that we need the space at the table. But at the same time, we have to just be honest and recognize the spaces that are being created of late. There are opportunities that are being created in these multilateral environmental conventions, including CITES, IUCN, APAC, and this same COP. And there are a lot of organizations that are actually coordinating the youth efforts. We have the ACBA, the African CSO Biodiversity Network. We have the Community Leaders Network. We have Southern African Trust. We have AWF and many, many other organizations, including the Global Biodiversity Youth Network, who are trying to ensure that the youth voices are actually appearing in these policies that are being made and the targets that are being set. But we just have to be ready. We have to be ready and make sure that we are working with the policymakers at a local level, ensuring that we are getting the necessary mentorship that we need from these people who are well experienced, get the knowledge that is needed. At the same time, be ready to contribute. Instead of just us crying the whole day, the whole night to say we need the space, we also have to be action-oriented, pick what we can, have input. Let us produce some position papers. Let us see what we can write about the policies that we want to change and make submissions. Let us go beyond declarations, singing and crying, because the spaces are actually being provided. We just have to be ready to look out for them and see how we can utilize them. I think that's what I can say in my conclusion.
Thank you so much, Bupe, for that rich response. Me, I like singing, so I don't know what you're trying to say, but thank you so much for that rich response. And, you know, it's really great to hear a representative of the communities and the most vulnerable population, and most importantly, young female youth. Lieberman, please, I'm going to give you 40 seconds.
Thanks, Shumirai. I think Bupe has already taken a part of my response, that social media is indeed a platform that we can use to influence change, to influence communities. I think we need to use social media responsibly to disseminate information. We need to use it to influence policymakers. A young woman living in a patriarchal society needs to use social media to circumvent patriarchism and patriarchal tendencies by getting into that space. But I'm alive to the fact that not all young people have access to internet. In fact, 25% of young people in SADC have access to the internet, and that means that the bulk of our young people don't have access to the internet. This is why in my presentation, I specifically say we need to support the work that organizations like BUPES are doing, where there is express community mobilization. We need to promote and protect the work that community organizations are doing in promoting climate change and in protecting the environment. We need to mobilize young people for action. So it's not just using social media, but we need to combine the advantages that social media has with the work, on ground work that is being done by community-led organizations. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lieberman, for that. And thank you so much to my panelists. Unfortunately, we've run quite a bit over time. But just thank you to my panelists for really honoring my invitation and you know, being so corresponsive with me throughout the past few weeks. I really knew that I was going to have a problem with the time because I picked panelists who would really richly contribute to the conversations, but I really do thank you all. I hope you guys can network, and those on the line, please feel free to contact Southern Africa Trust if you want us to connect you with any one of our esteemed panelists. And thank you to the panelists who actually, the people on the line who actually joined this conversation for almost 2 hours. It's really appreciated. And we really hope to see you at COP, whether virtually or in person. And I think from my end, I will close by quoting my brother who quoted Barack Obama, the 44th president of the United States, and just say to the youth that we are the first generation to feel the impacts of climate change, and we are the last who can actually do something about it. And that's a powerful statement. Not our children, not our children's children. By that time, it'll be too late. We are the last generation. And with that, I thank you all. I release you all. And thank you so much. And let's continue to correspond, to communicate. Please follow Southern Africa Trust on our social media platforms on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn. And we look forward to more vibrant and robust conversations. Thank you so much.